Thanks everyone, and thanks for that warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here, in case you can't tell by the smile on my face, and not only because I've flown here from Sydney, which, as I'm sure most of you can realise, is some trip. If you've got time, you should talk to one of us that have come from Australia and hear about the different legs of the journey going through Cyprus, etc. So absolutely thrilled to be here. I've met some of you already. For those I haven't met, I am Belinda Atkins and I'm the head of global payroll for the Commonwealth Bank. When I've met people over the last few days, I've kind of seen a few puzzled looks. Maybe some of you don't know the Commonwealth Bank as well as others. So to give you some sort of history and background, the Commonwealth Bank was founded 110 years ago, and it was originally started by the government and then privatised back in the early 90s. And the bank is now Australia's leading provider of integrated financial services. So something a lot of you may be surprised about is that the Commonwealth Bank actually has a global presence outside of Australia. And we've actually got employees sitting across 13 countries through Europe, Asia, New Zealand, USA, and obviously Australia. And actually, last night I was laying in bed after our beautiful night out, and I recalled that we actually had an office in Malta until about 18 months ago. So we had about 8 employees sitting here in Malta, and that was all about the breakup with the European Union, so Brexit, so we moved that office and we closed it down. It's a shame they're not here, actually, because I would have loved to have seen them. So to give you some of my history, my first job in the Commonwealth Bank was as a back office clerk. Now, I think this ties quite nicely to my future career in global payroll. And I look back at this role as one of the absolute highlights of my career. And it was super high energy, really fast paced. When I talk to you, it's not going to sound like the most exciting job, but I was actually sorting checks into pigeonholes. And in those days, in the late 1980s, all of the checks used to be sent back to the original banks. So you'd put them into these pigeonholes, and I'm talking thousands of checks each day. And at the end of the day, they'd go back to National Australia Bank, Westpac. They were going back to sort of other branches of the Commonwealth Bank, but you had to reconcile them all. And so if you didn't balance at the end of the day, you would actually stop all of the branch members from going home at the end of the day. So it was kind of high pressure. And you got to keep in mind, I was 18 years old at this time, first job in the bank. So it was like so exciting and so like kind of high volume, transactional. And I was doing this work for the proof machinist. And the proof machinist was sitting at the back of the branch. And for I don't know, some of you will know, but checks had the magnetic coating along the bottom of the checks. So they had all those little black numbers. And the proof machine would read all of those numbers. And all I wanted as an 18-year-old was to work up to that job. That was my dream job. And ultimately, I did get to that dream job. But now that work is done centrally through operational environments and operations centres. But back in the early 90s, I think that was my kind of first foray into customer service alongside a high volume, complex environment. And that's part of sort of what I've found I've loved over the course of my career. Now, how I sort of came to have an affection for the Commonwealth Bank was when I was 8 years old, my sister joined the Commonwealth Bank. And I'd grown up watching her go off to work in her work uniform, and she worked in one of our local branches, and on weekends, she'd come home with her work friends, and, they'd been out socially and they'd go off, to the pub after work. And as a sort of baby-faced 8-year-old, I aspired to her lifestyle. And in fact, when I joined the Commonwealth Bank, that's kind of what I wanted out of my job. And it's that ability not only to have a great place to work, but also a work family. And when I talk about the work family, I've got this kind of funny story. And I wish I had a thought of it earlier because I reckon I could have pulled out photos. But the Commonwealth Bank back in the 60s and 70s, it had like a mascot, and the mascot was an elephant. And I remember one barbecue on a Saturday afternoon at our house, and my sister was out there with all her work friends, and one of them was dressed up as the elephant. They'd obviously been off at some kind of street parade or something like that, but it still sticks in my head as one of those things that's just, it just really embedded in me that kind of work environment. And so I'll move forward to growing up. So I grew up in a country town in New South Wales. It was actually sort of a beachside suburb. It's about halfway, for those of you who don't know Australia as well, it's about halfway between Sydney and Brisbane, so on the mid-north coast. And you can probably see a picture up there now, actually, of the fishing village where I grew up. But I spent a lot of time working with my parents. And they had a couple of different businesses as I grew up and over the course of my teenage years. And I'd often help them with their payroll. Now, it was tiny. They had a couple of casual employees, but I'd sit down at night after school and help them run their really small payroll. What that meant, though, is that when I got my first paycheck from the Commonwealth Bank, I had a pretty good understanding of what was on my payslip. One of those businesses was an ice cream parlour. And you can see some photos there of my parents' ice cream parlour. Pretty cool. It was incredibly busy during those summer months because being in a coastal seaside village in the middle of summer, I think the population normally expands by about 5 times its normal size. So incredibly busy ice cream parlour. The other one was a service station, which had full driveway service. And so I was always there, checking tyres and filling up oil and that sort of stuff. And then later on, they had a homeware store. And though I'd joined the Commonwealth Bank by then, I'd still come home on weekends and work in the shop with Mum. And so I worked out pretty early that to keep your customers happy, it was all about the service methodology. And so how do you make them feel valued? And I remember when I was working in the ice cream parlour, you look up on a hot summer's night to what felt like 1,000 people. Probably it was a few hundred, and some of them would want double scoops, some would want triple scoops, and you had to work out really quickly, how do I get these people served? And so from an early age, I was working out, how to keep people happy, but still work, really fast-paced. Quite energetic. How do I get through this? And so I think that's kind of played a key part across the course of my career. And so I joined the Commonwealth Bank payroll team at a time when I was on a career break. And as many of you who are here and are parents will know, I was at home, I'd had 3 children, and I was living quite a mundane life, just, changing nappies and all that sort of stuff. And someone that I'd worked with previously said, we really need someone in our team who's got great attention to detail. Would you be interested in coming back to work? And to be honest, I was just happy to go to the interview so I could get out of the house. But having those 3 young children, I was definitely keen to get back into the workforce. I thought I could, talk to grown-ups again. But that was when I joined payroll. And so that's about 20 years ago that I joined payroll in the Commonwealth Bank. I was originally a contractor with the payroll team for about 18 months. And after about 18 months, I got offered the payroll team leader role. And I think that is about 20 years ago. And it's funny how you look back and just feel blessed that payroll found you. Because I feel like that's my true love and my true calling, is that I've always loved working in payroll. Yes, of course, you have your down days, but that love is still there. And I think it's the combination of the high volume complexity of payroll in general and just the excitement and enthusiasm you get from, Pay Close Friday. So our pay close is every second Friday. In fact, it's tomorrow morning. But I'm always excited on a Pay Close Friday. So in Australia, certainly in CommBank, we run our payroll fortnightly. Now, that can get a bit tricky because It's really like every fortnight's like Groundhog Day. You close one pay and then you're starting another one. But on that pay close Friday, and in fact, I'm even thinking about tomorrow morning how I get up early enough to help the team. I walk around the office full of excitement and enthusiasm. I'm talking to the team. How's everything going? What can I do? How can we help? And I think it's kind of that high volume thinking that you've just got to have, otherwise you'd burn out in a role like this. And I'm sure most of you work like that, otherwise you wouldn't have kind of landed in this room. It's that ability to be able to pivot all the time. What do you got to do next? Where are the hot spots? What's happening in the pay close? It's actually an incredibly complex environment. And I think it's just one of those things that you kind of either got it or you don't. And obviously everyone here does. But it's certainly that excitement that keeps me interested. And so over the last 20 plus years in CommBank, I've seen a lot of change in the payroll function. Most of that, though, the really positive stuff is around transformation and automation. And so originally, when I joined the payroll team, we were on a system where all the payroll data was processed through data entry for our Australian-based employees. Now, not long after I joined, we moved to a new payroll system in 2003, and that was where we were able to introduce some employee and manager self-service for our payroll and HR transactions. And we moved off that payroll system in March 2018, and that's when we transitioned over to Workday and GlobalView, and that's for our Australian-based employees. And we're actually celebrating our 5th birthday next month. You would not believe how quickly those 5 years have gone. But the transition from our payroll system into Workday and GlobalView, it presented some unexpected and pretty tricky challenges, to be honest. So we found that our payroll system that we were on, which was nearly 20 years old, had gone through some significant customizations. Now, who knew that we were going to find 1,500 custom tables that had been built in the back end that we had to solution for? Now, if we hadn't have solutioned for it, would it have been catastrophic? I don't know. I'd rather not find out though. So we had to find a solution for those 1,500 custom tables. Certainly we had to make sure that we had all possibilities covered. And I think the other thing you realize really quickly when you've had a system where you've done a lot of customizations, and I'm sure there's lots of you out here that have been through this scenario, is that how do you go from something that's really heavily customized into an out-of-the-box system? You want to be on something out of the box without customizations, because the more customizations you do, the more risk you introduce. So I think, that's something that we had to really work through, is in our transformation, keeping everything as vanilla as possible so that we could reduce that risk. And then, of course, you introduce other things when you do that around every time you make a customization and a patch goes in or you make some change to logic, you're again introducing more risk. So I think without a doubt that payroll transformation to Workday and GlobalView, definitely the most tricky of my career to date. Probably the great learning of my career has come through that project. And I don't know if it'll surprise this room, but the need for amazing change and comms teams is without doubt the successful delivery in every project. You can get, the config right and all that stuff right, but if you don't have the change in comms to deliver the messages out, to get managers and employees better prepared, it's all about the change in comms, and that's how you're going to deliver a successful project. So I really think that's key, is it's finding the hook for employees and managers about what's in it for them. So that is, really huge learning for me. I think the other thing is that I'm working through this exact scenario right now with a change in comms team, because we are moving our India workforce onto ADP in April 2023. So I've got this going on right now around me, so I know how incredibly important it is. Now, I think the other thing with a successful payroll transformation is setting up your team. So, all those things, getting the processes in place, standard operating procedures, how do you support it long term so that your team are ready to face all those challenges? You've got to develop your risk and controls framework. You've got to have everything ready to go from a day-to-day operational perspective from day one. And I think that's really key. So I'm thinking change and comms and getting your team ready to go. And then I guess that kind of leads me on to the three things I want to talk to you about. And these three things, I think, are intrinsically linked. And I think you won't have success without the three of them. And so the first is harmonization, so simplifying your landscape. Second is supporting that with automation and optimization. And finally, delivering a great employee experience. So let me dive into harmonization and simplifying the landscape. When we set out on this journey of harmonization, we looked at some of our data points, and what we found was that as an organization, we had 54 contract templates. We had 5 entities for our Australian-based employees that they could be employed under. And we worked the numbers on all of our possible entitlement pathways. And I've got to tell you, when I originally heard this, I thought it was mind-boggling, right? So we had 2.4 million entitlement pathway combinations. So if you're full-time, part-time, a shift worker, you're on one of these different 54 contract templates, you're on one of these 5 entities, there was 2.4 million possibilities. It was like a choose-your-own adventure. So what did we do about it? We set out on a path of contract simplification. So we've introduced 2 new enterprise agreements that cover 2/3 of our Australia population. And by doing that, we've delivered an 87% reduction in the amount of the obligations in our enterprise agreements. We've simplified the number of contract templates from 54 down to 5, of which 2 of those are legacy contracts. So hopefully we can actually get it down to 3 contracts. And we've moved our employees off the 5 different entities. They're now down to 2 entities. And whilst that combination of entitlement pathways is still pretty high, we've gone from 2.4 million to 350,000. And if you think, as payroll professionals and leaders who are sitting in this room, the risk reduction in how you configure a payroll system from 2.4 million to 350,000 is a massive success story. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is overpayments. So whilst all this work was going on with simplifying our landscape, we've been working on automation and optimization opportunities. And if I look at our processes, we had about 50% that were HR processes and 50% that were payroll processes. And we focused on some of these with our vendors like Workday and ADP. But a lot of the work has also happened within our own internal teams, and we've done that through leveraging technology and personalization. And so let me just give you a very brief outline of the work we've done to automate overpayments. So in CommBank, we pay our employees fortnightly, and we pay them a week in arrears, and then we project out a week. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this group that when you're doing that, it means you're constantly projecting someone's fortnightly payout by a week when you close the pay, and that way you invariably end up with overpayments. And so when we looked at this work, and before we started any automation, I actually had 7 FTE dedicated to completing all the processes each fortnight that sit around overpayments, whether it was entering offsets into GV, writing out letters to employees from an old Access database, processing repayment authorities, etc. So we set about to implement as much automation as possible with overpayments. And we did this by leveraging ADP GlobalView and Pega. And if you don't know, Pega is a workflow management tool. And so these 2 systems talk to each other, and they send out automated letters to employees who then accept a repayment plan, and that automates back into GV. And since the automation in December 2021, we've had a 72% reduction in the time it takes an employee to enter into a repayment plan from the time the overpayment occurred. And the original FTE projection of 7, we originally thought it'd go to 1 FTE, but I think it's probably a bit closer to 2 because we've picked up some other manual processes that didn't previously exist. But either way, that's freed up at least 5 FTE to do value-add activities. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is Dash. And Dash is our HR chatbot. And that's probably going to excite some of you because our chatbot is the first point of contact for HR support for managers and employees. And Dash was born in 2021. And to give you an idea on Dash's value, 4 months ago, we implemented changes to long service leave to our Australian-based employees. And to ensure the payroll was compliant, we made changes to all our config for state and territory-based legislation in Australia. And long service leave, I don't know if you know it, it's a very Australian thing. It's what you get for working for an employer for a long time. So in different states and territories, the milestone kicks off at either 7 years or 10 years, right? So we actually call it LSL, by the way. And so depending on whether what state or territory you're in, has different legislation. And so since we've introduced these config changes, we expected that we'd get a lot of employee inquiries. And so we got Dash, our chatbot, ready for this to go live. And since go live, which was in December 2022, so 2 months ago, we've had about 3,000, I think at last count it was 3,013 inquiries come through the chatbot. And the chatbot's answered 93% of those inquiries, which has meant the 7% of inquiries have come through to a human who's had to then look at that and work out, is it some sort of calculation, all those sorts of things. So really fantastic results from the chatbot. And it's completely, changed our employees' ability to get quick answers to things as well. So Dash, major success story. More than happy to talk to anyone about it because it's really exciting technology. So the other thing I want to talk about is our leave recovery initiative. And another thing that is really Australia-centric is that we allow long service leave and annual leave to accrue in perpetuity. So in some of my other countries where I have a payroll running, if you don't take your leave in the year it was granted, it's forfeited. Not in Australia. We let you keep accruing it forever, right? But what that does is it reprices the entire liability of the group. So annual leave and long service leave are entered via employee self-service through Workday. And we often see scenarios where employees forget to enter the leave that they've taken. So to combat this, we run a campaign to tell managers that we think their employees might have taken leave, but they haven't entered it into Workday. And so in our most recent campaign, which covered a 4-month period, and it covered Christmas, New Year, just gone, we got back $2 million of leave that hadn't been entered into Workday. So really, some really good successes there from that through our automation and optimization. And I think if you're looking to do any automation or optimization, if you get your foundation right, you've got good tech, you're only limited by your own imagination. And so that brings me to the third and final thing I want to talk to you about, which is a great employee experience. So we've nailed simplification of our landscape. We're working through the journey of automation and optimization, and these both play a huge part in employee experience, but they're not everything, right? And if I reflect inwardly on the challenges I face, I can categorically tell you that my payroll team are the most committed, accountable group of payroll professionals you're ever going to meet, right? They will stop at nothing to get that pay closed, attention to detail, every employee's in the pay. They'll work back as long as they need to get it done. But I'm sure everyone in this room can relate to what I'm going to say, is that I think that comes with a compromise. and the compromise is that everything else gets overlooked. So how do we balance closing a large complex pay against all the other priorities? So, employee inquiries, tickets, all those things. I think for me, it's a compromise. And so how do we get better at bringing our employees into the heart of everything we do as payroll professionals? Because in the words of Srini yesterday, payroll's a utility, right? So it's not just about closing the pay. These positions we hold are key to employee experience. And that's why I reflected earlier that I think all three are intrinsically linked, because I think you can't have one without the other. The ability from me and my team to deliver a great employee experience, it intersects with a simpler landscape. You couple that with strong commercial outcomes, tech that supports employees and managers, and data to build personalization. These are all the key elements to a great employee experience. And so I'll close out by saying, I think the role we have as payroll professionals is mastering these three things collectively. So I'd like to thank you for your time. If anyone wants to catch up with me, I'm more than happy to talk to everyone. Anything about the chatbot, anything at all, I'd be more than happy to chat with anyone. And thanks for your time.